need no lives for us.
So I'm a firearm violence researcher, and back at the start of the pandemic, we were tracking trends in firearm purchasing, which we do all the time, expecting a rise and we established that the size of the increase in purchasing was related to the increase in violence that occurred in the early time of the pandemic. But recall that some of that violence, it could be argued, was politically motivated, protests following George Floyd's murder and so forth. 2020 was also an election year. And by the end of that year, political violence was part of the landscape. And we're still monitoring gun purchasing, which is going off the charts more than in other presidential election years. But the kicker was purchasing didn't decline after the election. So it's mid-2021, and purchasing is still way beyond levels we'd ever seen before. We tracked this back to the 80s. And my question was, what is going on here? What are these people doing? And in the summer of 2021, I dove down a rabbit hole trying to find an explanation and discovered political violence, basically, as a field of research. And there was a quote in particular from a researcher who's now a colleague who said of the riots at the Capitol, a lot of people want to see January 6th as the end of something. I think we need to see it as the beginning of something. And that was an epiphany for me. And by the end of 2021, we were designing the first wave of what is now a 3-wave longitudinal survey looking at political violence.
Welcome to ePulse, bringing research and expert opinion to the bedside.
We're your hosts, Sarah Medeiros
and Julia Magaña.
Welcome back to ePulse.
Today we're going to talk about political violence and what it means for us in the emergency department.
But before we start, we should say that while all of us work at UC Davis, these thoughts and opinions are our own and do not represent UC Davis or the University of California.
That is usually our segue into a tough topic, Sarah. And this is a particularly tough topic because it's very political. The good news is we have a colleague who is studying this important topic and is here to talk to us about the facts that he is learning. Any discussion of groups or political parties and movements is all based on research and data.
In this podcast, you will learn what political violence means and how it applies to us in the emergency medicine community. And you will also learn what is known from surveys and what we should do as a community.
Okay, so to do this, we're here with our friend and colleague, Dr. Garen Wintemute. Garen is a distinguished professor of emergency medicine at UC Davis, and he is the director of the Violence Prevention Research Program. You may remember him from prior podcasts.
So welcome back, Garen. We talked about gun violence in the past with you, but this is a different sort of violence that we're discussing today. So first off, what is the meaning of political violence?
So first off, thanks to you both for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again. Let me get technical because we're going to be talking about some survey research. So I'm going to give you the definition that we used in the survey research instrument. We didn't use the phrase political violence in the survey. We used the phrase force or violence, and we defined that as physical force sufficient to injure or harm somebody. So we're not talking about yelling and making threats. We didn't define the term political, thinking we need to leave that up to our respondents. So what we used in the questionnaire was force or violence to advance a political objective that you support.
Garen, why is this an important topic to talk about in an emergency medicine podcast? Like, why should we be here today talking about it?
There are at least two reasons. One is the simple one. Violence is a health problem, and political violence as a subset is a health problem. You guys know I'm a clinician, I'm a violence researcher. What I saw was an emerging problem that not many people were paying attention to. Perfect opportunity for doing some research. So it's within our scope of practice, just the way firearm violence is within the scope of our practice. And oh, by the way, lots of political violence in this country will involve firearms. But there's something else for a clinical audience. I say this not for non-clinical audiences. we need to think of the departments in which we work and the role they will play in political violence. And it's not just that if large-scale violence breaks out in our city, we're the trauma centers, so we're going to get the cases. But I want clinicians to think about this. What happens when you've got a mass casualty event and the patients are armed? What happens when those patients are accompanied by armed colleagues? What happens when those two groups are followed by armed opponents? It's possible that your hospital will become the locus of an outbreak of political violence.
That is a really scary thought.
And I first thought about that over a year ago, but I've come back to it literally in the last week based on some new results we've got from the most recent wave of our survey, where I think it is really possible that we will see in major cities large-scale outbreaks of politically driven violence, potentially even before the election.
So what I'm hearing from you, Garen, is that we should see all types of violence, including political violence, as our lane because it impacts our patients and the health of our patients. But even more nuance to that is disaster planning and a new type of disaster planning because you may be in the center of ongoing conflict. Is that fair to say?
Later today, I am going to be contacting the security and law enforcement personnel at this hospital, fulfilling a promise I'm making in something that I wrote just last night. Part of my job right now as a researcher is to make sure my hospital is ready.
So, Garen, take me back a little bit and tell us how you are learning about this issue and how this kind of got started.
We decided the best way to do this was to ask people about their views on political violence, whether they support it or not, if they support it, whether they're willing to participate in it, under what circumstances. And then being researchers, we wanted to identify factors associated with support for and willingness to participate in political violence. So we set up a large scale, there are more than 12,000 participants in wave one, large scale, longitudinal, nationally representative survey. So large I've defined. Longitudinal means we're contacting the same people over and over again annually, asking, in some cases, the same questions and then asking new questions, but we're able to measure within individual change over time, which is really important. We were in the field with wave one in the middle of 2022. Wave 3 was in the field in May and June of this year.
And who are these people and how did you figure out who you were going to survey?
It was important that the population be nationally representative. So we worked with a commercial survey research firm named Ipsos. The firm might be familiar to some of your listeners. It's a highly regarded public opinion survey firm. They executed the survey according to our design and using our questionnaire. But again, especially with large numbers and a lot of statistical weighting, the results of the survey represent the adult non-institutionalized population of the United States.
That's a really powerful tool. What did you learn from those surveys?
Let's track change over time a little bit, since we're designed to do that. In wave one in 2022, 1 adult in 3 told us that they thought violence, as defined, was usually or always justified to advance at least one political objective. 1 adult in about 6 told us in 2022 that they thought civil war was coming. 1 in 20 told us that violence was justified in 2022 to put Donald Trump back in the White House. And there's much more. There are dozens of questions. We were really stunned by this. So let me give you some good news. We came back with those questions and more in 2023. And in 2023, support for political violence fell from 1 in 3 to 1 in 4. Still lots, but a trend in the right direction. So, expectation of civil war fell from about 15% to about 6%. Again, particularly in relative terms, a big change. 2023 was not an election year. 2022 was off-year elections. And I would have bet my next month's paycheck that when we were back in the field this year, we would have seen all those numbers go back up again because it's the year we're all living through. And it didn't happen, which is really important. We're going to be talking about some pretty grim stuff. And I want to emphasize that there's some really good news here. We are not seeing a rebound in support for political violence in 2024 in the population as a whole. That's really good news.
I would have also expected that increase with what seems to be in the news and what we're seeing around us. Maybe that's just headlines to gather our eyes, but that's a pretty surprising finding there.
Well, I was worried about it after, Donald Trump had his ear shot. Yeah. I was worried that there was then going to be more of this.
Two things about that. First off, let's just acknowledge it didn't happen. The retaliation. The research community is very, very concerned about the prospect of retaliatory violence. Not our work, but other credible survey research has asked people, do you think political violence is justified? Actually, they make it partisan. Do you think it's justified for people of your party to use violence against members of the other party? And support for that is very low. But then those researchers say, well, what if they do it to you first? And support skyrockets. So let me fold in some more of our information. And this time, just from this year on retaliatory violence and on spread, we focused on civil war some this year, or large-scale conflict, but civil war is a nice way to describe it, and that's what we said in the questionnaire. We didn't just ask people, did you think it was coming? We also asked them, do you think we need one? And again, support did not increase from 22 to 23. But in 2024, we asked people, well, suppose it happens. How likely is it that you will do any of the following things? And there was a long list, but I just want to focus on one. And that was, how likely do you think it is that you yourself will participate as a combatant? You'll have a weapon. More than 85% of people said, no, I'm not going to be a participant. Only about 5% said that it was very or extremely likely, I'm getting technical with the questionnaire, that they would participate as a combatant. So good news number one is maybe not so many combatants. But when I say 5%, we've got to remember this is the adult population of the United States, 2.5 million people per percentage point. So 5% is still a lot of people. But here, frankly, is the really good news. We then asked those people, we asked the non-combatants and the combatants, how likely is it that you would change your mind, switch to the opposite pole if you were urged to do that by your family members, by your friends, and others? For the non-combatants, not a chance. Less than 5% of them said that they would change their minds under any circumstances. But for the people who said they thought they were likely to be a combatant, 40% of them said they would change their minds if their family urged them to do that. 30% said they would change their minds if their friends urged them to do that. And sort of between 20 and 30 for religious leaders, community leaders, even just if the media said, don't do it. So to me, that's sort of the shining light here. Not only is participation in political violence unusual, but the people who tell us in a survey that they'll do it are also telling us in that same survey, but I can be talked out of it, which leads straight to intervention. And that intervention is, for the vast majority of us who say no to political violence, it's really simple. We just have to say that out loud over and over again. If we've got family members who disagree, my message is tell them you disagree, because they'll change their minds. They'll come around to your point of view. And if I can go back to a point we started with, that violence is a health problem. I trained in injury epidemiology. That's kind of how I got into this. I'm always looking for the connections to what we know about health problems and behavior change. So if violence is a health problem, the decision to participate in violence is a health behavior. We know a great deal about how to change health behavior. One of the things that we know is messages from family, messages from friends, messages from respected leaders make a huge difference. And it's turning out the people are telling us, I'm not guessing, that that's the same thing for political violence.
That's super interesting that those same public health principles can apply here. I honestly would not have guessed that that would be the message from all of this, but it's exciting because now we have some tools that we can use already.
Yes. And I was anticipating it, to be honest.
You were.
I was. Because you guys know this, but this is a radio show and your listeners can't see me. I'm old. I've been doing this for a long time. and I cut my teeth on motor vehicle injuries back in the early 1980s when motor vehicles were sort of the tip of the spear for the idea that injury and, by extension, violence was a public health problem. And that wasn't a theoretical proposition. It was, first off, if it's not a health problem, why are all these people dying from it? But number two, it was shown empirically that if you treat motor vehicle injuries and later if you treat violence, the way you treat other public health problems, you learn important things and those things lead to interventions and those interventions work. So it passes the duck test. And, in emergency medicine, we're all about duck tests. So it works.
Yeah.
We are looking at and publishing data from all three waves of the survey at the same time now because they came one right after another. And there's an analysis that we've had a hard time getting published, in part because I think of how controversial it is, and it has come right back into the news, and I need to talk about it. In the first wave of the survey, we asked people, among many other things, remember we're looking for risk factors, how much they approved of a bunch of right-wing violent extremist organizations and movements. I'm going to name them. The Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys, and then the white supremacy movement, the Christian nationalist movement, the Boogaloo movement, the militia movement, and QAnon. And nobody's surprised, the people who approve of those organizations and movements are off the charts for their level of support for political violence, their willingness to participate in it, their willingness to kill, could we ask that question? Their willingness to kill to advance a political objective. We gathered that information in 2022, but we're also living through real time. And there were the sedition trials, the leadership of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys are now in prison. People kind of took their eye off the ball, and we just kept trying to get the information published, but we moved on to newer data. But we're not done yet. Do you guys remember the presidential debate in 2020 when Donald Trump was asked to disavow right-wing violent extremists? And he didn't do it. He instead said specifically to the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
Yes, I remember that.
I think we know what they were standing by for, and that's what I want to talk about. There's been a series of reports in the last few months establishing that the militia movement is reorganizing, probably has more members than ever before, that the Proud Boys have lost their leadership, but they've developed a new organizational structure. They are recruiting. They are back. So let's fold some other info bits from history into the mix. All along, arguably, Donald Trump was encouraging activity by those groups as private groups. Liberate Michigan, back at the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping controversy time, etc. The Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters were major participants in January 6th, which is why their leadership is now in prison. But fast forward to now, Donald Trump and associates are again using the usual dog whistle techniques to encourage violence without explicitly encouraging violence. And I think it's entirely likely to see, as a commentator pointed out last week, that the Proud Boys, the militia organizations like them, will literally in the next few weeks, the next couple of months, organize into the American version of the brown shirts that we had in early Nazi Germany, the black shirts that we had at the beginning of fascist Italy. But that's not even the worst of it. Here's the worst of it. It's been known for more than a year that the Trump administration planning apparatus plans to invoke the Insurrection Act on their first day in office. The Insurrection Act, for listeners, allows the President of the United States to federalize local law enforcement, to federalize the National Guard, and to deploy the United States military on U.S. soil against U.S. civilians. And that's the plan. But it's not just a plan in theory. People these days are wargaming a lot of what might a second Trump administration look like, what might a Harris administration look like. They play this. But it's very serious kind of wargaming. The person who plays the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would be a retired four-star general. The person who plays Donald Trump would be a retired head of the Republican National Committee. These are people who know the roles they are playing. So there's been reports in the media lately. There's a movie now about some of these war games. And in particular, in wargaming of a second Trump administration, there are protests. The Insurrection Act gets invoked on day one, and all those things that I just mentioned happen. But I was in a webinar when people who run these war games were describing what went on, and I asked a question in the chat. Does the administration make first use of violence? And does the call-up extend to making deputy federal marshals out of civilian militia groups, which under the Insurrection Act is legal? You can make a deputy marshal out of basically anybody. And the answer was yes on both counts.
Wow.
So in a second Trump administration, there is the chance that we will see thousands, tens of thousands of members of private militia organizations, the Proud Boys, as pro-violence as they are, as willing to kill as they are, armed and carrying federal badges to help enact the agenda of an authoritarian president. So really early, actually, I think before we started recording, I told you I was writing an op-ed. I've just given you the gist of that op-ed. I told you I was going to be telling the hospital to get ready. This is what I'm telling them to get ready for, that within weeks to months, we could be seeing outbreaks of political violence that are part of a plan, not arising from the public in the sense that I, frankly, and most others, I think, have taken it, but as part of a plan to enact an authoritarian regime here.
So to reconcile this with your survey information, the facts that you've been delivering, this is really speaking to that 5%, that very small percent, and even shrinking, but still powerful numbers, and being empowered by an alternative mechanism. That sphere of influence might come from the political party that they affiliate with, how they see themselves in the role with that political party, and could be that loud voice. Just like we can be a loud voice to decrease political violence, that loud voice could say, yep, 5%, here we go, it's your time.
Yep. When we got our very first survey results in 2022, I was really focused on the scary stuff. The 1 in 3 who said, I think political violence is justified, the 1 in 8 who said, I'm willing to participate. And my colleagues were saying, Garen, you're ignoring the vast majority of your respondents. And I said, you guys are right. But the little voice was saying, what about the bad guys? What about the bad guys? And I've come back around to realizing we need to pay attention to the bad guys because they have a plan.
And another thing that I remember reading in one of your articles as well was that this same group, this small percentage that are willing to enact violence, tend to be the ones who are more likely to be carrying weapons.
Yes.
Is this right?
Yes. They're more likely to own assault-type rifles. No surprise. It's the tool for the job in this case. They're more likely than others to have bought guns recently. So I may have been right at the beginning when we saw that anomalous surge. Maybe people really were arming up in 2022. By the way, we don't see a comparable surge at the moment as we approach the election, and we follow it every month. So I have data for August here in the second week of September, and we're not seeing it. Maybe they bought all the guns they need for 24 in 2020, but I'd much rather have no surge than surge right now. But yes, not just the militia and the Proud Boys. We know this for them and those other groups I mentioned, but for people who endorse political violence, people who are willing to participate. Here are the people who are more likely than others. Republicans more than Democrats. MAGA Republicans, Make America Great Again Republicans, more than other Republicans, let alone others. Men more than women, but by less a degree than you might imagine. Firearm owners, a little bit more than non-firearm owners, but not so much. The big differences are among firearm owners. People who own assault-type rifles, bought weapons recently, carry guns all the time. Not legal here in California, but in much of the country it is. So we've written about, understand, dear reader, that at this moment, there are thousands of people walking the streets of the United States who are armed and committed to political violence. What are we going to do with that? There's the broader problem. We have 400 million guns in private hands in the United States, more guns than people. And what do we do with that? The problem with firearm violence that we have is a sign of what we're doing or not doing with it. But for the larger problem of political violence sort of as mass movement, I really think the data point to a solution. I'll use a metaphor. It's fire season. We're in fire country. Political violence is a spark. The rest of us are the ground. We just got to make sure that when that spark drops to the ground is wet. It doesn't spread. We don't retaliate. We don't endorse. It just dies. And maybe it has to die over and over. Maybe there are going to be lots of sparks this year, but we don't need a conflagration. But for that small committed minority, other than if you see something, say something, I don't know what the rest of us do. That's what law enforcement's for.
Now, Garen, I'm curious because as our listeners probably know, you are a big part of the Bullet Points project here. And we've talked about that project before in terms of what we as clinicians can do to maybe have a role in reducing firearm violence. Do you think that there is a role for clinicians in the ED or in a public space to also help in this?
Yes. So still to be defined because we don't have the kind of experience that we do with other forms of violence. But this one is easy. Physicians are leaders in their community. Not all of us accept that role, but the public puts it on us. And this is one of those times when we can use it, when any doctor anywhere, any of your listeners can just stand up, metaphorically speaking, or literally in a public session and say, look, I care for all of you. You all are my patients or might be my patients. This community is my patient. And I have a message for you all, my patient. Trouble is coming and we can avoid it. And here's how. And what that person is doing at that moment is two things. One is they're communicating important information about a health behavior, but the other is they're modeling it themselves. They're setting the example. It's the same thing as when an elected official makes such a pronouncement. And there's a whole literature on the value of elected officials saying, hey, we need to tone down the rhetoric. It works. Physicians are the people to point out the inevitable health consequences of political violence and what it means, not just for the people who get hurt, but as we all do all the time, what it means for the community. If my emergency department is taking care of a mass casualty incident involving political violence, we're not available to do the other things. But a physician can also be one of the people who says, so, folks, let's look at our community here and let's imagine two futures for our community. In one, things go on kind of as they are at the moment, as we would project. In the other, there's a large-scale incident of political violence in our town. People are intimidated from voting, all that kind of stuff. Which community do you want to live in? What do those two trajectories look like? We have a choice to make now.
Garen, I like that message. That's a really good example of words that we can use, analogies that we can use. But where do you suggest that the individual share that message? I know you do op-eds. Is that something that you recommend other people do? Or what would be a good platform for people to share that message on?
I am a big fan of public communication because it works. So I would encourage all of your listeners to play the most publicly accessible role they are comfortable with, and then take it a step further and get a little uncomfortable because they'll discover that they can do it. We've all made that discovery. It works. People want to like their doctors. People want to trust their doctors. People want to believe that their doctors have the broadest interest at heart. And there's no better way to encourage that belief than by demonstrating it, by going public. At the same time, I think there will be opportunities in individual encounters to deliver this message. I can't be really precise here because we're still just working this out. But we all know, in general, the bullet points message is when it's appropriate, bring it up. I work triage. I see 80 patients a shift, and it's easy for me to encounter times when I might say a word or two about guns and try and prime a conversation that the treatment team will have. I have yet to encounter that situation with political violence. And to be honest, in the public domain that is our triage area, I'm not sure how I'm going to handle it. But I think those opportunities will be there.
So it's more of like a public-facing approach and a little bit more on our own internal lives, right? Like in our own private lives as well. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I think I would add something. This probably isn't specific to physicians, but we may have more opportunities than others. And that's a message that everybody's already heard a bazillion times. If you see something, if you hear something, say something. So we are all in a position. Maybe somebody's had a little bit too much to drink and is really angry and starts making threats and whatnot. Maybe those threats have a political overtone as opposed to an intimate partner violence overtone or something. Whatever that context might be, we have a responsibility, having acquired that information, to pass it on to people who can do something about the threat. Here in California, it has led to a gun violence restraining order, an extreme risk protection order for a national listenership. In other places, that might not be available, but it's still a time to contact law enforcement. Hey, I got this guy. He's talking some scary stuff, and I need to pass the baton.
I saw that if you see something or hear something, say something throughout many of your publications, Garen. And I also thought, I know that usually is associated with say something to law enforcement, but it seems like an opportunity to start conversations with inside of our own family. And I know that you've mentioned that as a tool here. Do you have any phrases or if you had a family member or a close individual with inside of your sphere of influence, what would you say to them? Can you give us a few key phrases
Sure.
we can use?
I have such people. I'm not going to name them, but I have first-degree relatives who are very much on the opposite side of the spectrum from me. I take the same approach I do with patients. So let me talk about that. I ease into the topic. I don't do it if anybody's been drinking, but I will ease into the topic. Here's what I do with a patient. Some of the things we're talking about have me a little bit concerned about safety. And when that flag goes up, there are some other questions I ask, about guns and drinking and maybe some other topics. So, for example, are there any guns in the home? I might not say that last phrase quite as straightforwardly as I did here and now with you guys, but I did something on purpose. I used the term guns about 10 seconds before I asked the question. So that gives that person subliminally 10 seconds to go, jerk's going to ask me about guns. But the defensiveness is up and gone. The other thing I do, I even do this in triage, and I certainly do it when I'm in a less structured setting. I will, unless it's just physically impossible, I will reposition myself so that I'm not sitting in an en face kind of confrontive position relative to the patient. I come and sit beside them. So we are literally on the same side of whatever it is we're about to talk about. I make myself small. I hunch over. I'm not taller than they are. If I happen to be standing and they're sitting, if there's a chair, I take it. All of that stuff that we know. And I apply that to people I know socially just the way I do to people that I'm interacting with professionally. And the reason I do that is because all of us know professionally, it makes a huge difference. And my objective is to make a difference.
Yeah, I like that. That's very practical.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, those are very useful in an in-person setting. I think that same idea of finding common ground can be used in an online setting, whether you're posting something on TikTok or, a blog that you have, to sort of show your readers or your audience that you do understand them, you do have some commonalities between you, but here, let's talk about what I think is important.
Yes, I completely agree. Personally, I don't participate in social media. I decided to keep focused on the things that I know well and can do well. But again, there's a huge literature, there's a world of common experience on the value of establishing common ground first. And here it might be, for all our differences on policy, et cetera, can we agree that we don't want violence? Are there people here in this conversation who want there to be violence? If so, we'll deal with it. But the vast majority of us don't. Great. Can we agree that violence will not be how we resolve our differences? If we can get to there, to me, it's take the win and go home time. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to resolve political differences. That's not my job. I'm trying to prevent violence. So if we can agree to have differences and not be violent about them, touchdown.
Okay, so bottom line, Garen, there is some hope because there is a shrinking number of people, at least in 2023, and looks like it's holding through for 2024, that see political violence as a pathway forward. But the reality is, we live in the reality in emergency medicine that there is a small and mighty committed group, and that there are sparks that are flying in the political world that could ignite that. From a department perspective, from a hospital perspective, we need to say it out loud, recognize that this may be an issue, come up with disaster plans that have that added aspect of people being armed when they're coming in injured. And on the individual level, if you see something, if you hear something, say something, and don't be afraid to have those conversations in your community at large and also with inside of your own home. Is that a fair summary?
That's perfect.
Thank you, Garen, so much for sharing your wisdom and your insight, for asking these questions and helping us to have good answers. I really appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thank you both for having me.
Well, that's it for now. That's a lot.
It's a lot.
If you learned something today, pay it forward. Share this podcast with a colleague and follow us on social media at EM Pulse Podcast.
And this episode was another great idea from our listeners. So if you have a pitch for a podcast, let us know.
Thank you to our department for asking and answering these kinds of tough questions.
And thanks to OM Productions for making this episode happen.
Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and stay tuned.